Thank you very much, Your Excellencies, Your Excellency, the Chair, fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen. I have a number of things to say. I have a presentation, but I will try and focus on several particular issues that I think are pertinent. The title of my talk is Building Resilience for Sustainable Development. As my introduction elaborated, I've spent quite a bit of time, something like nearly 20 years, working on elements of the growth in small economies, and I want to pick up on a number of points, building upon what Professor Brigulia has already said about vulnerability, resilience, and so on. I sometimes feel that when I'm asked about climate change and the implications for small island states, that I'm expected to provide a solution to long-term climate change, which I don't feel I'm neither able to do so, nor do I think that is possible, but rather we have to build up strategies to deal with inherent problems and the longer-term issues. Just to reiterate a number of the points that have already been made, but from a slightly different view, from an economics point of view in terms of vulnerability and resilience, we can identify a number of critical issues which feed through all of the discussions that we have in terms of the sources of growth, the sources of vulnerability, building resilience, and implications for climate change adaptation and mitigation. And those are the key characteristics of small economies, small populations with all that they imply, the limited resources, particularly in terms of natural resources. Sometimes some of the small economies, particularly in the Arab Gulf, have been very fortunate and have oil, but many economies do not have anything like that. Limited resources in terms of the population. But then we start to think about what the implications of small populations and limited resources are, and these are critical in terms of constrained diversification in all senses of the word, having a diversified production structure, having a diversified trade structure, employment structure, and so on. Yet, possibly appearing paradoxical, we have also openness to trade and the concept of structural openness to trade. That is, there is no choice. By their very nature of being small, small economies have a very high degree of involvement in the global economy, whether they like it or not. That is the only way that they can survive. It is the only way in which they can provide a full range of consumer goods and services to their population, as well as technology and so on. And it is that openness that has important implications with respect to their growth, with respect to their vulnerability, but also with respect to their policy making, in the sense that it greatly constrains the sorts of policies that can be adopted by governments to deal with the day-to-day running of an economy, but also in terms of the long-term problems caused by growth volatility and the potential impacts of climate change. Over the years, my colleague and myself have done several studies of the key sources of economic growth in small economies. And the three sectors that are predominantly important in terms of delivering, in the first instance, high incomes and strong levels of economic growth are tourism, financial services, and that's the broader range of financial services, including information processing, data analysis, and so on, and moving into information technology-based internet activities, but also natural resources, both fisheries, minerals, but also fisheries and so on. Interestingly enough, the contribution of manufacturing, we've already mentioned niche manufacturing this morning, the contribution of manufacturing is actually of very, very minor importance. While agriculture, in terms of large-scale traditional agriculture, is seen as a potential constraint on growth and actually holds many economies back. And that's interesting in the sense that many small economies do not have significant agricultural sectors by their very nature. But those that do, those that have been involved in monocultures, whether for export or primarily for domestic consumption, appear to have lower levels of income and lower levels of economic growth. The important implication I just want to pick up on with respect to structural openness on trade is that trade openness fits in very nicely with what we might call the Washington Consensus on promoting comparative advantage in economies, rather more so than in larger economies. However, the more open an economy is, the more vulnerable it is to growth volatility. And the more vulnerable economies are, the greater the need for resilience. So we have a direct link here between the structural openness to trade, growth volatility, and the need for resilience. And, as I said before, the domestic policy-making autonomy is highly constrained by this structural openness. There are a number of studies of growth volatility. These are large-scale, looking at all countries in the world. There are virtually no studies of small economies themselves, but the general conclusion of these large-scale studies are that volatility reduces long-run growth. So those countries that are more vulnerable, have greater growth volatility, deliver lower rates of growth. And the second effect is, the two principal groups of countries that are most severely affected by growth volatility are, first of all, low-income countries, because these are the least able, they have the lowest resilience capacity to deal with the problems raised by growth volatility. And the second group, which may or may not include low-income countries, are those with weak institutional structures, in other words, poor governance. And there is some overlap between the two, but just because a country has poor governance does not mean it is not necessarily a middle-income or high-income economy. I just want to kind of summarize one or two points relating to openness, because there is some degree of confusion both in the academic literature, but particularly in terms of the policy literature with respect to small economies and what these implications are. The first is there is a general consensus that greater trade openness leads to greater exposure and greater vulnerability to terms of trade shocks. However, the next element is that greater trade openness is the very factor that delivers a significant proportion of growth to small economies. And that should not be forgotten or put to one side. The next point is interesting in particular, and that is that a number of studies find that trade openness more than compensates for the adverse impacts of growth volatility. That is, that the growth benefits of being structurally open to the global economy more than compensate for the adverse growth impacts of the volatility. The conclusion from that are twofold. The first one is a kind of policy recommendation, which is that any proposals to reduce openness to trade would therefore likely reduce incomes and reduce growth, and possibly even increase growth volatility further. Such that what the arguments appear to be saying is that integration into the global economy has a positive impact not only on growth and incomes, but also, to some extent, reduces the adverse impacts of growth volatility. It certainly does not eliminate it. It just smooths some of those effects. I want to move on very briefly to some points about building resilience capacity. And we can identify a number of elements from the economic side relating to trade structures. One of the things we've already heard about, small economies have a high degree of concentration in terms of their export structures, and that merely reflects their production structures. but they also tend to be highly concentrated in terms of dependence on a very small number of critical export markets, one or two in some cases. Secondly, Ambassador Diarra has already talked about foreign direct investment. One of the elements here and potential for growth is to improve domestic linkage capacity. That is, taking on board the existing investment and using that to improve domestic activity related to those linkages. There are potentials for enhancing domestic social capital and governance, and this is important, and also the potential for taking out insurance to at least partly mitigate some of the unforeseen consequences of growth volatility. A number of small economies are highly indebted, up in the HIPC categories, and one of the reasons for their high levels of debt are simply relating to trying to deal with the adverse consequences of growth volatility. They've been using government expenditure and new borrowings to try and smooth out the growth process, and this has led to debt. So there is a very strong relationship between indebtedness and growth volatility, which needs to be recognised by policymakers in the international institutions. I'm just going to mention FDI very, very briefly before I conclude, and that is an interesting aspect of foreign direct investment relating to small economies is that small economies have been unexpectedly successful in attracting foreign direct investment. And one of the principal explanations for this is the high degree of openness. Foreign direct investment is very, very strongly interested in open economies. So even though we might assume that small economies would be unattractive to a lot of types of foreign direct investment, it appears that many aspects of their economic activity are attractive. And therefore, this building of linkages, but also market access, market knowledge, and skill capacity, management know-how, and so on, is all a potential resource that can build the resilience of the local labour force. Just to make some concluding comments, small economies face a range of challenges. Many, however, in spite of these challenges, have achieved growth and high incomes. The high structural openness has implications for their growth volatility. I haven't talked about natural disasters, but that is a separate and distinct major impact on growth and volatility. And that is why building resilience capacity is so important, and that trade is a means of assisting that. There are a range of potential policies to improve the current situation and also deal with the long-term implications of climate change, adaptation and mitigation. And finally, sustainable development is dependent upon a combination of effective policy that is founded upon social capital and good governance. Just to kind of build up some final comment based on Professor Briguglio's comments about good governance, there are questions about whether small economies have good governance. And one of the interesting aspects is that their need to be successful and open in their economic strategies partly drives governance domestically, because getting policies wrong are so costly. Thank you very much.